Picture this. You're watching The Lion King for the 100th time, and that final scene hits. Rafiki holds up Simba and Nala's newborn cub as the entire Pride Land celebrates. The circle of life continues. Everything's perfect. But here's what Disney desperately hopes you'll never realize. That cub you're looking at? He was supposed to have a name. He was supposed to have a story. He was supposed to be the star of the sequel. His name was Kopa, and Disney erased him from existence. Now, before you think this is just another fan theory about unused concepts, let me stop you right there. This isn't about rejected ideas or creative changes. This is about something far more sinister. Disney didn't just decide not to use Kopa. They actively worked to make you forget he ever existed. And when you understand why, it reveals a side of Disney that they've spent decades trying to hide. See, Kopa wasn't some fan-made character or internet creation. He was official Disney canon. The Walt Disney Company published an entire series of books called The Lion King: Six New Adventures in the mid-1990s. These weren't knockoff products or unauthorized fan fiction. They carried the official Disney logo, were sold in Disney stores, and featured the Disney copyright. Kopa appeared in multiple stories as Simba and Nala's firstborn son, the rightful heir to Pride Rock. But here's where it gets weird. When The Lion King 2 was released in 1998, there was no mention of Kopa. None. Instead, we got Kiara, supposedly Simba's firstborn daughter. The books that featured Kopa? Suddenly they were being phased out of Disney stores. The character who was meant to be the future king? Completely absent from the sequel that should have been his story. And Disney's official explanation? That the cub at the end of the first movie was just a symbol, a nameless, genderless representation of the circle of life. They even gave it the dismissive nickname, Fluffy. Can you imagine? They took their own officially published character and retroactively declared him meaningless. But the evidence of a cover-up is everywhere once you know what to look for. Watch the presentation ceremony at the end of The Lion King, then compare it to the opening of The Lion King 2. Different location, different weather, different animals present, different ceremony entirely. These aren't the same event. They can't be. Which means Disney is asking us to believe that Simba and Nala had two separate cubs, held two separate ceremonies, but only one of them mattered enough to get a sequel. The visual evidence is even more damning. Look closely at the cubs themselves. The one at the end of the first movie has lighter fur, different markings, and a completely different build than Kiara in the sequel. Disney's animators are incredibly precise. These differences weren't accidents. They were deliberate attempts to create two different characters while hoping no one would notice the switch. And here's what really gives away the deception. Disney has never been able to keep their story straight about this. In some interviews, directors claim they always intended the first cub to be female. In others, they admit it was meant to be male. Some say the sequel was always planned to focus on a daughter, while others claim they never even considered the first cub's identity. These aren't the inconsistencies of creative evolution. They're the contradictions of a cover-up. But the most disturbing part isn't that Disney erased Kopa. It's why they felt they had to. Because when you dig into those original Kopa stories, when you read what Disney actually published under their own name, you discover content so dark, so inappropriate for their family brand, that it threatened to destroy everything they'd built with the Lion King franchise. We're talking about stories involving child endangerment, psychological manipulation, and themes that would make any parent think twice about showing them to their kids. Disney had published these stories, put their name on them, and then realized they'd made a catastrophic mistake. They couldn't unpublish the books, but they could make sure the character never appeared in anything mainstream again. But what Disney doesn't want you to know is that Kopa's removal wasn't just creative housekeeping, it was damage control. And the lengths they went to in order to erase this character reveal a pattern of corporate manipulation that goes far beyond one lost lion cub. This is the story of how Disney discovered that some of their own official content was too disturbing for their brand, and how they systematically worked to make sure you'd never connect the dots. It's a story about corporate control, creative suppression, and the disturbing truth about what Disney considers acceptable for children. And it all starts with understanding exactly what was in those Kopa stories that Disney found so threatening. To understand why Disney was so desperate to erase Kopa, we need to examine what they actually published about him. And I'm warning you now, This content is disturbing in ways that make you question how it ever got the Disney seal of approval in the first place. Let's start with A Tale of Two Brothers, the most widely distributed of the Kopa books. On the surface, it seems innocent enough. Young Kopa goes on adventures, learns lessons, grows up in the Pride Lands. But dig deeper into the actual plot, and you'll find scenarios that would traumatize most children and horrify their parents. The story features a young cub being deliberately placed in life-threatening situations by adult family members. We're not talking about cartoon peril here. We're talking about psychological manipulation where adults use a child's trust to put them in genuine danger. The book describes scenarios where Kopa is lured into traps, abandoned in hostile territory, and forced to witness violence between adult lions who are supposed to protect him. But that's just the beginning. The real disturbing content comes when you analyze the power dynamics at play. These stories normalize the idea of children being used as pawns in adult conflicts. They present family dysfunction and emotional manipulation as acceptable plot devices. Most shocking of all, they feature adult characters who view children as expendable tools rather than individuals deserving protection. Now, you might think Disney just didn't realize how dark this content was when they approved it. But that excuse falls apart when you consider the editorial process. These books went through multiple layers of Disney approval. Editors read them, marketing teams reviewed them, corporate executives signed off on them. This wasn't an oversight. This was Disney consciously deciding that this content was appropriate for children. And here's where it gets even more disturbing, the Zira connection. While Zira wouldn't appear in Disney films until The Lion King 2, her character concept existed during the development of these Kopa books. The original storylines involved a female antagonist who specifically targeted Simba's offspring, not as part of some grand political scheme, but out of personal vendetta against a child. Think about the implications of that. Disney was publishing stories where an adult lioness hunts down and attempts to harm a cub, whose only crime was being born to the wrong parents. This isn't the sanitized villain versus hero dynamic we see in Disney films. This is an adult targeting a child for elimination, and the books describe this pursuit in disturbing detail. The psychological themes get even darker when you examine how these stories handle trauma. Kopa is repeatedly placed in situations where he experiences genuine terror, abandonment, and betrayal by trusted adults. The books don't gloss over these experiences. They detail his emotional responses, his nightmares, his developing trust issues. Disney was essentially publishing children's books about childhood trauma and its lasting effects. But perhaps most disturbing of all is how these stories normalize dysfunction as entertainment. Family members lie to each other, betray each other, and use emotional manipulation as standard tools of conflict resolution. The books present these behaviors not as problems to be solved, but as natural aspects of family life that children should accept and adapt to. Now, here's the timeline that Disney hopes you'll never piece together. These books were published in 1994 and 1995, right at the height of The Lion King's initial success. Disney was riding high on their family-friendly renaissance, positioning themselves as the gold standard for wholesome children's entertainment. The Lion King was being praised specifically for its positive messages about responsibility, family, and growing up. And then someone in Disney's corporate structure actually read these Kopa books. Really read them. Analyzed them from a public relations perspective. Considered what would happen if child psychologists got hold of these stories. Imagine the media coverage if parents realized what Disney was selling to their children under the Lion King brand. The realization must have been terrifying. Here was Disney, the company built on wholesome family values, selling books that featured child endangerment, psychological manipulation, and emotional trauma as entertainment for kids. Books that normalized dysfunction and presented adult-child relationships in ways that would make any responsible parent deeply uncomfortable. But here's the catch. The books were already published, already distributed, already sitting on shelves in Disney stores and bookshops across the country. Disney couldn't unpublish them without drawing attention to the problem. They couldn't recall them without admitting there was something wrong with the content. They were trapped by their own corporate approval process. So they did the only thing they could do. They began a systematic campaign to make sure Kopa would never appear in mainstream Disney media again. No movies, no TV shows, no major merchandising. The character would be allowed to exist in those already published books, but he would never get a platform big enough to draw attention to the disturbing content Disney had accidentally approved. This wasn't creative evolution. This was corporate damage control. And the evidence of Disney's growing panic becomes clear when you look at their increasing emphasis on brand management in the late 1990s. This was when Disney began implementing much stricter content controls, more layers of approval, and more careful consideration of how their products reflected on the overall brand. The Kopa situation had taught them a terrifying lesson. They could accidentally approve content that undermined everything they claimed to stand for. Content that could destroy their reputation as a family-friendly company if it ever gained widespread attention. But simply keeping Kopa out of future projects wasn't enough. They needed to ensure that if anyone ever connected the dots between the disturbing book content and Disney's brand, they could distance themselves from responsibility. They needed plausible deniability, and that's where the real conspiracy begins. Because Disney's solution wasn't just to ignore Kopa. It was to systematically rewrite the narrative of their own creative process, to make it seem like the character never really mattered in the first place. To gaslight their own fans into believing that what they remembered never actually happened. The question is, how far was Disney willing to go to protect their brand from the dark content they'd already put into the world? The timing of Disney's Kopa erasure reveals a calculated corporate strategy that goes far beyond simple creative differences. To understand the true scope of this conspiracy, we need to examine what was happening inside Disney during the mid-1990s, and how the Kopa problem threatened to derail their entire corporate rebranding effort. In 1994, Disney was undergoing a massive transformation. This wasn't just about making better movies. This was about reshaping Disney into a global family entertainment empire. The company was expanding into cruise lines, theme park resorts, and international markets. They were positioning themselves not just as an animation studio, but as the world's most trusted name in family values. But there was a problem. Disney's reputation was built on trust. Parents trusted Disney to provide safe, appropriate content for their children. That trust was their most valuable asset, worth billions in brand recognition and customer loyalty. And the Kopa books threatened to destroy that trust in the most damaging way possible. Think about it from a corporate perspective. Disney had spent decades building their image as protectors of childhood innocence. Then suddenly they had official Disney products featuring child endangerment, psychological manipulation, and family dysfunction. Products that, if they gained attention, could trigger congressional hearings, boycotts, and regulatory scrutiny. The corporate panic becomes clear when you examine Disney's response timeline. The Lion King 2 entered development in 1996, just as Disney was beginning to understand the full scope of the Kopa problem. But instead of simply creating a sequel featuring their established character, they made a series of decisions that only make sense as damage control. First, they created an entirely new protagonist. Not Kopa, but Kiara, a daughter instead of a son, with a completely different personality and story arc. This wasn't creative inspiration. This was deliberate character replacement designed to make audiences forget about the original heir. Second, they restructured the entire Lion King timeline. The sequel takes place during Kiara's childhood, but with no mention of any older siblings. No explanation of what happened to the cub from the first movie. No acknowledgement that there was ever supposed to be another story. They simply pretended the continuity problem didn't exist. But the most telling evidence of corporate interference comes from analyzing the production constraints placed on The Lion King 2. The film had to tell a complete story while avoiding any references to previously established canon. It had to create new conflicts while ensuring none of them echoed the disturbing themes from the Kopa books. It had to appeal to families while carefully avoiding any content that might remind viewers of the darker material Disney had already published. These weren't creative choices. They were corporate mandates designed to create maximum distance between Disney's mainstream products and the problematic content they were trying to bury. The merchandising angle reveals even more about Disney's calculations. Kopa, as presented in the books, was a traumatized character dealing with family dysfunction and psychological manipulation. How do you market that to children? How do you create toys based on a character whose stories involve betrayal, abandonment, and emotional manipulation? Disney's merchandising machine depends on characters that children want to emulate, that parents feel comfortable buying, and that represent positive values. A psychologically damaged lion cub dealing with family trauma doesn't exactly scream profitable toy line. The character was fundamentally unmarketable under Disney's family-friendly brand standards, but the legal implications were even more concerning for Disney's corporate structure. By the mid-1990s, Disney was facing increasing scrutiny over their content standards. Parent groups were analyzing Disney products more carefully than ever before. Child psychology experts were beginning to question the effects of entertainment media on young minds. Disney's legal team must have realized they were sitting on a potential lawsuit goldmine. If child psychologists ever analyzed the Kopa books and declared them psychologically harmful, Disney could face class action lawsuits from parents who had purchased the books trusting Disney's reputation. The company could be held liable for emotional trauma caused by content they had officially approved and marketed to children. The safest legal strategy was to minimize the character's visibility while maintaining plausible deniability about the content. Disney couldn't recall the books without admitting fault, but they could ensure that Kopa never gained enough mainstream attention to trigger serious scrutiny of those stories. And here's where the conspiracy gets really disturbing. Disney had done this before. Kopa wasn't the first character they had quietly erased from their continuity when he became inconvenient. Look at the pattern. Disney has a long history of creating characters, testing audience response, and then eliminating those that don't serve their corporate interests. Characters that were too complex, too controversial, or too difficult to merchandise simply disappear from future projects without explanation. The difference with Kopa was the scale of the problem. This wasn't just a character that didn't test well. This was a character whose official stories contradicted Disney's entire brand identity. The stakes were higher, the potential damage greater, and the cover-up more extensive. Disney's solution was systematic and thorough. Phase out the books gradually, never reference the character in mainstream media, create new continuity that makes the old stories irrelevant, and most importantly, control the narrative by making anyone who remembered Kopa seem like they were misremembering or obsessing over minor details. The fluffy explanation is the smoking gun of this strategy. By claiming the cub at the end of The Lion King was never meant to be a specific character, Disney was retroactively invalidating their own published content. They were gaslighting their own fans, making them question their own memories and experiences. But the corporate documents from this period, internal memos, production notes, marketing strategies, would tell the real story. They would show Disney executives discussing the Kopa problem, strategizing about damage control, and coordinating the systematic erasure of a character they had already marketed to millions of children. Of course, Disney will never release those documents. They're probably buried so deep in corporate archives that most current Disney employees don't even know they exist. But the circumstantial evidence of a coordinated cover-up is overwhelming once you know what patterns to look for. The question is, if Disney was willing to go this far to hide the Kopa problem, what other dark secrets are they protecting? And how many other characters, stories, and creative decisions have been quietly erased because they threaten Disney's carefully crafted image? Because the evidence suggests that Kopa's disappearance wasn't an isolated incident. It was Disney perfecting a system for burying inconvenient truths that they would use again and again in the decades that followed. The smoking gun evidence of Disney's Kopa cover-up isn't hidden in some secret corporate vault. It's hiding in plain sight, embedded in the very films Disney hoped would make everyone forget the character ever existed. But once you know what to look for, the evidence of systematic concealment becomes impossible to ignore. Let's start with the most damning piece of visual evidence. The deliberate continuity breaks in The Lion King 2. Disney wants you to believe this film is a direct sequel, but the opening ceremony is filmed in a completely different location than the ending of the first movie. Different rock formations, different lighting, different crowd arrangements. These aren't minor animation inconsistencies. They're deliberate attempts to create visual distance between the two events. But here's what's really disturbing. There are moments in The Lion King 2 where you can actually see Disney's artists struggling with the Kopa problem in real time. Watch Simba's reactions when Kiara gets into trouble. His fear isn't proportional to normal parental concern. It's the terror of someone who has already lost a child. The animators are showing us a father haunted by previous trauma, even though that trauma is never explained in the film. The most revealing moment comes when Kiara slides down a rock and her fur falls across her face in a specific pattern. For just a few frames, she looks exactly like the male cub from the end of the first movie. This wasn't an accident. Disney's animators were acknowledging the connection they weren't allowed to explain. They were leaving breadcrumbs for viewers who remembered what came before. Even more telling is how the film handles Simba's overprotectiveness. His behavior makes no sense unless you understand that he's already experienced the loss of his firstborn. The dialogue hints at past trauma, the staging suggests previous tragedy, but the film can never explicitly address what happened because that would mean acknowledging Kopa's existence. But the visual evidence is nothing compared to the contradictions that emerge when you analyze interviews with Disney's creative team. And this is where the cover-up becomes truly obvious because these people cannot keep their stories straight. Director Darryl Rooney has given at least 4 different explanations for why The Lion King 2 focuses on a daughter instead of the son from the first movie. In 1998, he claimed they always intended to tell Kiara's story. In 2004, he said the decision was made to appeal to female audiences. In 2019, he suggested it was about exploring different family dynamics. Each explanation contradicts the others, and none of them address the fundamental continuity problem. Producer Jeanine Roussel has been even more inconsistent. She's claimed that the first movie's cub was always female, always male, and never meant to have a specific gender, sometimes in the same interview. These aren't the innocent inconsistencies of creative evolution. These are the contradictions of people who have been coached to avoid discussing something specific. But the most revealing interviews come from the original voice actors. Matthew Broderick, who voiced adult Simba, has mentioned in several interviews that he recorded dialogue referencing a son who was no longer with them. Those lines never made it into the final film, but their existence proves that the Kopa storyline was actively considered and then deliberately removed. The fluffy explanation deserves special attention because it represents Disney's most audacious act of corporate gaslighting. By claiming the cub at the end of The Lion King was never meant to be a specific character, Disney was asking fans to believe that their own published books were somehow unauthorized or mistaken. But here's the problem with that explanation. Disney's own marketing materials from 1994 contradict it. Promotional materials for the Lion King video release specifically mentioned Simba's son and the future king. Disney's own press releases discuss the character's significance to the story's themes about legacy and responsibility. The company was actively marketing the cub as a specific, important character, until suddenly they weren't. The timeline of Disney's changing explanations reveals the evolution of their cover-up strategy. In 1998, they claimed creative differences. In 2004, they emphasized marketing considerations. By 2010, they were suggesting that fans had misremembered or misinterpreted the original material. Each explanation moved further away from acknowledging any corporate responsibility for the discontinuity. But the most disturbing evidence comes from analyzing Disney's broader pattern of content suppression during this period. Kopa wasn't the only character who disappeared without explanation. Disney was systematically reviewing their entire catalog and eliminating elements that didn't align with their evolving brand standards. Characters with complex psychological profiles were simplified or removed. Storylines with mature themes were rewritten or abandoned. Entire projects were shelved if they raised questions about Disney's commitment to family-friendly values. The company was conducting a massive retroactive editing of their own creative output. The Kopa erasure was just the most visible example of a much larger corporate strategy. Disney was learning to control not just their future content, but their past content as well. They were discovering that they could manipulate public memory by simply refusing to acknowledge inconvenient parts of their own history. And here's where the evidence points to something truly chilling. Disney wasn't just covering up the Kopa character. They were covering up their own creative process. The disturbing content in those original books revealed something about Disney's internal standards that the company found unacceptable to acknowledge. The books showed that Disney had approved, published, and marketed content that contradicted their public image. Content that revealed a side of the company that was willing to traumatize children for entertainment value. Content that suggested Disney's family-friendly reputation was more marketing construct than corporate reality. By erasing Kopa, Disney wasn't just eliminating a problematic character, they were eliminating evidence of their own corporate hypocrisy. They were burying proof that their content standards were nowhere near as rigorous as they claimed. But the most disturbing revelation is still coming, because the evidence suggests that Disney's willingness to erase Kopa was just the beginning. The company was discovering that they could manipulate public consciousness, control cultural memory, and rewrite their own history with virtually no consequences. And once they realized how much power they had over their audience's collective memory, they began using that power in ways that would fundamentally change how Disney operated as a creative and corporate entity. The question isn't just what Disney was hiding about Kopa. The question is, what did Disney learn from successfully hiding Kopa that they've been applying to everything else ever since? Here's the truth that Disney desperately hopes you'll never understand. Kopa's erasure wasn't just about one problematic character. It was Disney's proof of concept for something far more sinister. The realization that they could manipulate public memory, control cultural narratives, and rewrite their own history with virtually no consequences. Think about what Disney actually accomplished with the Kopa situation. They took an officially published character, featured in multiple books carrying their corporate logo, and convinced millions of fans that he never really mattered. They created a collective amnesia so complete that most people today don't even remember the character existed. That's not creative evolution. That's psychological manipulation on a corporate scale. But the most disturbing part isn't what Disney did to Kopa. It's what they learned from doing it. They discovered that their audience would accept almost any narrative change, no matter how illogical, as long as it was presented with enough corporate authority. They learned that fans would question their own memories before questioning Disney's official explanations. The Kopa erasure taught Disney that they had unprecedented power over cultural memory. Power to decide which stories mattered, which characters deserved to exist, and which parts of their own history would be allowed to survive. Power that no entertainment company had ever wielded before, and power that they've been expanding ever since. Look at the pattern of Disney's behavior in the decades following the Kopa cover-up. Notice how quickly they began reimagining classic stories, replacing original versions with new interpretations that better served their current corporate interests. Notice how often they've retroactively changed character backgrounds, relationships, and motivations to align with evolving brand standards. This isn't creative growth, this is systematic historical revision. Disney learned from Kopa that they could eliminate inconvenient aspects of their own catalog and replace them with more marketable alternatives. They discovered that audiences would accept these changes as natural evolution rather than recognizing them as corporate manipulation. But the psychological impact on fans reveals the true scope of what Disney was doing. People who remembered Kopa, who had connected with his stories, found themselves being told that their memories were wrong, that their emotional investment in the character was based on a misunderstanding, that what they thought they experienced never actually happened. This is gaslighting at a corporate level. Disney was using their cultural authority to make fans question their own perceptions and experiences. They were training audiences to defer to official narratives rather than trusting their own memories. They were creating a fan base that would accept any revision, no matter how contradictory, as long as it came with Disney's seal of approval. And here's the most chilling realization: it worked. Disney successfully convinced millions of people that an officially published character was never really important. They made fans forget that they had ever cared about stories that Disney had marketed directly to them. They created a collective amnesia so complete that questioning it now seems paranoid or obsessive. The Kopa erasure was Disney's proof that they could control not just entertainment, but memory itself. They could decide what their audience was allowed to remember about their own experiences. They could eliminate evidence of their past mistakes and replace it with sanitized narratives that better served their current corporate needs. But the implications go far beyond one lost lion cub. Because once Disney realized they could successfully erase Kopa, they began applying the same techniques to other inconvenient aspects of their history. Characters with complex backstories were simplified. Stories with mature themes were rewritten. Entire creative periods were retroactively edited to align with current brand standards. The pattern is everywhere once you know how to recognize it. Disney has systematically eliminated references to creative decisions that don't serve their current corporate image. They've buried evidence of past content standards that contradict their family-friendly reputation. They've rewritten their own history to make it seem like they've always maintained the same values and standards. And the most disturbing part is how they've trained their audience to participate in this historical revision. Fans now actively defend Disney's right to change their own continuity. They attack other fans who remember inconvenient details from Disney's past. They've internalized the corporate narrative so completely that they police each other's memories on Disney's behalf. This is what Disney learned from successfully erasing Kopa. They could make their audience complicit in their own manipulation. They could turn fans into enforcers of corporate-approved narratives. They could create a culture where questioning official explanations was seen as toxic or obsessive behavior. The Kopa situation set a precedent that Disney has been exploiting ever since. Every time they retroactively change a character's background, every time they reimagine a classic story, every time they declare that previous continuity doesn't count, they're using techniques they perfected during the Kopa cover-up. But here's what should terrify every Disney fan. If they were willing to go this far to hide one problematic character, what else are they hiding? What other dark content has Disney buried so deep that we don't even remember it existed? What other corporate mistakes have been erased so thoroughly that questioning them seems impossible? The evidence suggests that Kopa was just the beginning. Disney has been systematically eliminating inconvenient aspects of their own history for decades. They've been training their audience to accept increasingly dramatic revisions to established continuity. They've been expanding their power to control cultural memory with each successful manipulation. And the most chilling possibility of all, Disney may have discovered that they can eliminate not just characters and stories, but entire creative periods from public consciousness. They may have learned that they can make their audience forget whatever aspects of Disney's history they find inconvenient. The real question isn't what happened to Kopa. The real question is, what else has Disney made us forget? What other characters, stories, and creative decisions have been so thoroughly erased that we don't even remember losing them? Because if Disney was willing to gaslight their own fans about an officially published character, if they were willing to rewrite their own history to hide their past mistakes, if they were willing to manipulate public memory for corporate convenience, then what aren't they willing to do? The Kopa erasure wasn't just about protecting Disney's brand from problematic content. It was about Disney discovering that they could reshape reality itself, at least within the boundaries of their cultural influence. They learned that they could make their audience complicit in forgetting whatever truths became inconvenient. And once you understand that level of corporate manipulation, once you realize how thoroughly Disney has been controlling your own memories and perceptions, you have to ask yourself, what else have they convinced you to forget? What other parts of your own experience with Disney have been quietly erased and replaced with corporate-approved alternatives? The disturbing truth about Kopa isn't just that Disney buried him. It's that they buried him so successfully that questioning his absence now seems crazy. They made his erasure so complete that remembering him feels like a delusion. And if they could do that to Kopa, what other aspects of Disney's dark history are still buried out there, waiting for someone brave enough to dig them up and disturbing enough to refuse to forget? The Mouse House has been rewriting history for decades. The only question is, are you ready to remember what they've made you forget?